had it not been for the crime spikes that we've seen over the last several years, I don't think that Kim Foxx would have made the calculation that she made. I don't think that Mike Schmidt would be where he is today, or Chesa Boudin, to name another person. So I do think that there is something of a backlash happening right now. Now, does that necessarily mean that we're going to see an undoing of everything that's been done in the last 4 years in the way of pretty radical criminal justice reforms, particularly at the state and local level? I don't think so. But this is a good sign, right? It's a sign of life.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. Brandon Johnson, Eric Adams, Karen Bass, Brandon Scott, Muriel Bowser, Tashara Jones, Michelle Wu, London Breed, Latoya Cantrell, and Ted Wheeler. They're all big city mayors, and they're all interchangeable parts. Put Brandon Johnson in New York and Eric Adams in Chicago, and nothing would be different. Put Muriel Bowser in Portland and Ted Wheeler in D.C., and nothing would be different. Different people pursuing the same defund, decriminalize, and decarcerate policies produce the same result, which is to say, chaos. The same can be said of America's big city, largely George Soros-funded prosecutors. For example, put Kim Foxx in Philadelphia and Larry Krasner in Chicago, and nothing would change. But is the ground starting to crumble under the feet of these neo-Marxist potentates? To an apparatchik, they argue that violent crime is on the wane, thanks to them, of course, and they cite modest declines in murders and shootings from their 30-year highs from just a couple of years ago. But are the residents of metropolitan areas who aren't fleeing ready to deliver a reckoning? There are some signs of intelligent life we've seen over the last couple of years. San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin was recalled. Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx chose not to run for re-election. St. Louis Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner resigned. And most recently, Multnomah County DA, that's Portland, Mike Schmidt was defeated in a primary by a candidate running on a law and order platform. These are still exceptions, to be sure. But is this an indication a delayed political boomerang is going to hit more urban politicians? With the moral panics of both George Floyd and COVID in the rearview mirror for most, is something approximating sanity returning to America's metropolises? Or is that just wishful thinking on my part? To answer that question and give us a description of what a return to sanity would look like to be properly described as such, we're pleased to be joined by Rafael Mangual. Rafael is the Nick Ohnell Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a contributing editor of City Journal and a member of the Council on Criminal Justice. Rafael is also the author of the book Criminal Injustice: What the Push for Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts the Most. Rafael, welcome to Counterculture. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me on, Dan. Really appreciate it.
So, what do you say? When I see Mike Schmidt get taken out of his prosecutor post in Portland, and Kim Foxx feeling like she can't run again in Cook County, Illinois, because she can't win again, am I seeing the beginnings of some sort of reckoning with these decarcerate, defund, decriminalize prosecutors, or as I asked at the outset, is it just sort of wishful thinking on my part?
I certainly think there's some of that going on, to be sure. I think that had it not been for the crime spikes that we've seen over the last several years, I don't think that Kim Foxx would have made the calculation that she made. I don't think that Mike Schmidt would be where he is today, or Chesa Boudin, to name another person. So I do think that there is something of a backlash happening right now. Now, does that necessarily mean that we're going to see an undoing of everything that's been done in the last 4 years in the way of pretty radical criminal justice reforms, particularly at the state and local level? I don't think so. But this is a good sign, right? It's a sign of life. It's a sign that people are not happy with the status quo and that they might be looking elsewhere for answers. But I do want to make very clear that, in order to get back to where we were sort of pre-2014 in terms of overall crime numbers, And, as I've said on your show before, I mean, I do think that the 2020 crime spike was really a continuation of the spike that really began in earnest in 2014. If we're going to get back to that, I do think that we need deeper, more structural changes that have to be made to the criminal justice system writ large. If you just look at the year that followed the death of George Floyd, you had something like 30 states enacting more than 140 different police and criminal justice reform bills just in that year. The idea that a couple of election results that are relatively surprising has undone everything that's represented by that massive amount of legislative action, I think is a little misguided. So there's still a lot of work to do, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, the lag effect. We're seeing evidence of that lag effect you're talking about with all the policies from 3, 4, and 5 years ago. So, for example, there was a story just out recently that New York City has its lowest number of police officers since 1990. They're losing 200 police officers a month. And so, the use of the language defund is sort of dissipated. But hamstringing police officers is still something that these prosecutors and big city mayors are doing. And the results are that police are still leaving in droves. Crime, a lot of categories of violent crime is still up year over year, even from historic highs of 3 and 4 years ago.
That's exactly right. I mean, a lot's being made of the relatively small declines in homicides and shootings over the last couple of years. And look, I mean, I just want to be very clear. It is better that those numbers are going down instead of up, right?
Of course.
This is something that we should be applauding. But, as you say, we still haven't fully recovered from the sort of 2020 era spike, and lots of other crime categories are moving in the wrong direction. And like I said, I mean, there's just been a lot of sort of structural change on the criminal justice front that doesn't seem likely to get undone anytime soon. So, when I see some of these big city mayors, switching their rhetoric, as we've seen with Muriel Bowser or London Breed, it's encouraging, but it doesn't really tell us that we're going to get all the way back. And as you say, there are a lot of structural issues that remain, particularly with the policing side. The NYPD is down to probably under 33,000 officers, I would think, at this point. But even in places like Washington, D.C., where they've instituted, I think, $25,000 signing bonuses, they are still something like 500 officers short in that department. So to the extent that those problems remain sticky, I do think that we're going to see, a lot of the challenges remain.
So other structural changes, particularly in New York State and Illinois, no cash bail. How important is that structural change in those states, particularly, I mean, it's a more aggressive form in Illinois, but it's sort of the same deal. It's going to be a while before we have, really robust data to maybe make some determinations about impact, but you certainly can make predictions about the incentive structure that no cash bail presents and what's likely to occur and anecdotally what has occurred. Is that something that in those states and other states that may essentially be doing it in certain jurisdictions in a de facto way, if not by law, like New York and Illinois, how important is that policy change, or how detrimental is no cash bail as a quote unquote criminal justice reform measure?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's detrimental on net. I mean, and with respect to Illinois, I don't necessarily think that you need to wait a very long time to get data to tell us, what effect it's actually having. And the reason I say that is because the city of Chicago had been experimenting with a very similar bail policy at the city level for years before the Safety Act was actually implemented. And, we actually do have data and pretty good statistical analyses looking at what effect that particular reform initiative had. And I think it shows very clearly that on net, the city of Chicago saw more crime than it otherwise would have seen in the absence of that reform policy. And I think the same is true in New York. I mean, the data out of New York show, I think, pretty clearly that for the population of offenders who have prior criminal histories, particularly more recent arrests, we are seeing a pretty significant increase in their post-release recidivism. And, people will say, well, the overall recidivism number is pretty low, Well, the reason that they're able to say that is because they're looking at the entire pretrial population, but the entire pretrial population was never going to jail to begin with, right? I mean, if you want to sort of be responsive to the critique, what you should be looking at is a subset of the pretrial population that would have been most likely to end up in detention under a saner regime, right? And those are the individuals, like I said, who have prior criminal histories, who have these other risk factors that are associated with recidivism. And when we look at those individuals and break them out, at least in New York and in some of the other jurisdictions where these studies have been done, what you find pretty consistently is that the more liberal bail policies are associated with increases in post-release offending. The question that I have is, how do the politics of that play out? And I don't know that I have a very good answer for that, right? I mean, in New York, we are 4 years on now from the onset of the bail reform that was done at the state level. There's clearly, it's very unpopular. There's a sort of clear consensus in the polling that people believe that judges in New York should be able to consider the dangerousness that a particular criminal defendant poses. We're the only state in the union that bans judges from actually considering dangerousness in pretrial detention. We've had the crime increase, and it's been a very sticky crime increase since the enactment of that reform. We've seen an explosion in things like retail theft. And yet there does not seem to be any viable effort or any high likelihood of that law getting trimmed back in any significant way. I mean, they've tinkered with it at the margins during a couple of different legislative sessions, but in terms of actually making the changes that would sort of align the bail policies with the ideas of folks like myself and other people who have sort of criticized the overly lenient approach to pretrial detention. I mean, I just don't see that coming. And so what I worry is that, the sort of rhetorical changes, the, election wins here and there for local offices, that's about the best that we can hope for in the absence of some catastrophe on the crime front, which is, I think, what it might take to get people to sort of reconsider these broader questions that are going to require a lot more political capital being expended to get victories.
One of the important aspects of your work that we've discussed before, but it bears repeating, is just how preventable so much of this violent crime specifically is. Violent crime and sort of quote unquote nonviolent crime, which, and I know you'll go into this, is not exactly nonviolent crime. Retail theft is not exactly nonviolent crime the way it's described, and I want you to address that. But, Eddie Johnson, who was the former superintendent of Chicago Police a few years back, said famously, look, there's about 2,000 people in Chicago that we know are likely to kill or be killed, right? We know who the preponderance of the predators are. We know who they are. We know who is engaged in illicit activity on a regular basis, that are threats to the public safety on a regular basis. And if we could, and I'm not, we're not pre-criming this. This isn't Minority Report. We're not going to arrest people before they committed a crime. I'm not talking about that. But we know so if we could police that population, and if we could punish that population when they inevitably do commit crimes, mostly against each other, because a lot of it's gang related, as you know, then right. It sends a message to the entire ecosystem. Sends a message that violent crime will be punished. You will be removed from the street for a long time. It sends and it's the same thing with prosecuting retail theft and other crimes that can escalate into real violent crimes. If you send it, so there are tens of thousands of Class X felonies committed in Chicago every year. But if you focused on that small percentage of the population that is responsible for a preponderance of the violent crime, it has a positive multiplier effect throughout the system. It's like there's so much preventable crime. We do have the ability to get our hands on it if we had the political will to do so.
I mean, that's exactly right. Every single time that you do the statistical analysis in cities across the country, what you find is the very same thing, which is that the vast majority of the serious violence is driven by a very, very small share of the population. There was a problem analysis done in the city of Oakland back in 2014 that found that it was less than 1% of that city's population was responsible for a majority of the shootings. This is a pattern that you're going to see throughout the country. And so you're exactly right to say that, we can use data analysis and we can use social network analysis to identify who the likely shooters are going to be. And if, in fact, we police those individuals very closely, and actually bring consequences to bear whenever they do come into contact with the criminal justice system, not only will that send a message, as you say, but in my opinion, more importantly, what it will do is it will incapacitate people who are high rate offenders. You have this population of people who are committing 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 felonies a year. If you can take them off the street for any given amount of time, whether it's 30 days, whether it's a year, whether it's 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, what you're doing is you are sparing the community a significant number of felony offenses that would have been committed during that time, each of which comes with a significant social cost. Right. And that's, to me, the most important aspect of this, right? Because whenever you read a story about a heinous offense that's being committed, whether it's a homicide or a rape or a string of robberies, and they catch the perpetrator, inevitably what you find is that the individuals responsible had, some very, very lengthy criminal history, or they had an active criminal justice status, right? They were out on pretrial release, they were out on probation, they were out on parole. What that tells you is that the police are actually doing a relatively good job. Serious violent criminals don't advertise their violence openly, right? They tend to try and hide their offending, right? So it's important to understand that, like, sometimes these individuals are going to come into contact with the criminal justice system for relatively low-level offenses, for misdemeanor offenses. If these are the individuals that your data analysis is telling you, are responsible for significant shares of the crime in your jurisdiction, if it's telling you that they're in a gang, if it's telling you that they've got 20 or 30 prior arrests, if it's telling you that they've popped as a suspect in multiple shootings, well then, maybe it's a good idea to prosecute that misdemeanor, even if it's only going to get that individual 30 days, right? Because those 30 days could seriously matter to a community that is significantly suffering at the hands of that individual who is committing crime after crime after crime.
Right, and yet here we have, talking about what's been proposed by Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx on the way out, and what is the disposition of these Soros-funded progressive prosecutors that you were just describing generally. And Kim Foxx is saying draft policy, it hasn't been implemented yet, but it's trial ballooning it. And depending on the reaction she gets in Chicago and Cook County, you may see this mimicked in other urban centers as well, which is no traffic stops for essentially administrative offenses, right, like no, expired registration or tinted windows or a broken taillight, because black residents are 6 times more likely to have their vehicles searched in a traffic stop like that than are whites. And so she's invoking the race card again here to say the only way to do this is to have police stopping people because they think that person is a bad guy and they're using an expired registration as the means to roust him. Well, right. First of all, pretextual stops are unconstitutional, so we already have a prohibition against.
No, are constitutional.
Those. Unconstitutional.
No, they are constitutional.
They're
constitutional.
The pretextual stops are constitutional, but the idea of the kind of stop that Kim Foxx is arguing is race-based is unconstitutional, right?
Right. You can't make stops based solely on race, right? But the Supreme Court has ruled that using pretexts to stop individuals is completely constitutional, so long as there's probable cause for the violation that they stopped you for, right? So the Supreme Court has said, for example, right, if you conduct a traffic stop for an expired tag, or because they have something dangling from their rearview mirror that they're not supposed to have, based on the suspicion that you might find a gun during the course of the stop, as long as you had probable cause for that initial violation, right, whether it's the expired tag or the thing hanging from the rearview mirror, then whatever you find is completely fair game.
So long as you had so long as then you had probable cause to do the search.
No, well, probable cause to do the search comes later, right? So
right.
This is the part that Kim Foxx doesn't understand, right? Because what she's saying is that her office isn't going to pursue cases that originate with these kinds of interactions based on these kind of pretexts. And the problem with that is that she's essentially penalizing good policing. because this is precisely what you want police to do, right? Good police who understand the beats that they are assigned to and understand who the players are will figure out ways to initiate interactions that will eventually lead to the discovery of contraband. That's how policing gets done, right? Like I said before, I mean, criminals very rarely advertise their crimes outwardly, right? I mean, the crack dealer doesn't lay his vials out on a, on a fold-out table in the middle of a busy intersection and say, "Here, I've got black tops for sale. Please come and browse." No, I mean, they hide it, right? The gangbangers, like I said, they don't ride around with their guns and visible holsters on the side of their hip like police officers do. The sexual assailants don't send out press releases in advance of their attacks to say, "Hey, I'm going to be groping women at the Jackson Red Line stop," right? So the way that the way that you do policing is you have to figure out ways to initiate contact with suspicious individuals, and that often, if it's done right and if it's done well, is going to be how you get at a lot of these more serious crimes. I mean, I can't speak for the data out of Chicago, but I can tell you that in New York in the year 2020, 42% of all gun arrests began as traffic stops.
Right.
So, if this was Kim Foxx's jurisdiction, so she's going to throw away 42% of gun cases? I mean, what does that mean for the safety of the communities that she, says she cares about?
At the same time she, like other prosecutors, say, we're not prosecuting retail theft because we're focusing all the office's resources on gun crime and violent criminals. And then they turn around and they assume that every traffic, because they're, this is the implicit bias, they assume because the data is such, or at least let's just take her data as accurate, just for the sake of argument. I don't know if it is, but let's just say for the sake of argument it is. They take that and say, well, that obviously means that police are targeting black individuals. That obviously means that that's the reason they're being stopped and they're being searched, and they probably don't have probable cause and so forth. She's just making all these assumptions, and then she sort of makes a policy statement, and she's just a good example of being the bad example. She sort of makes a policy statement in the wake of the Dexter Reed police-involved shooting, the video, the body cam footage that came out a few weeks ago, made national news, and the typical, 11 shots. He was shot 11 times and so on and so forth. 100 rounds were fired by this tactical unit that pulled over Dexter Reed in a traffic stop. And she says, well, if they hadn't pulled him over in the traffic stop, Dexter Reed would still be alive. And the police officer who was shot and wounded by Dexter Reed, who opened fire on police, which initiated the firefight, he wouldn't have been shot. And so, I mean, but this is the mentality you're dealing with. So if we don't do any traffic stops, and searches with traffic stops, and we announce that, then you're right, police are going to be safer, and criminals are going to be safer. The only wrinkle is everybody else is going to be less safe.
Right. That's exactly right. I mean, that kind of argument that she made, it just betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of what good policing is, right? I mean, this is a unit that stopped Dexter Reed that is not out to enforce traffic laws, right? Their mandate is to get at serious gun crime and to identify and apprehend gun offenders. And is Kim Foxx's argument that it was just pure coincidence that he happened to be armed and willing to use deadly force against police when they pulled him over? Right? I mean, it's exactly what you want police to do, right? You want them to focus their limited resources in the places with the most serious problems, and ideally on the individuals that are the drivers of those serious problems. So when they use a pretext like some kind of minor traffic violation to stop a suspected gun offender, and it turns out that that person is in fact gun offending, well, then that should be applauded, not penalized. The community, right, should be able to enjoy the benefits that come from those kinds of interactions, that come from those kinds of stops. And what Kim Foxx is saying is that she's going to deny the community the potential benefits that would be associated with the eventual incapacitation of the individuals that are arrested with illegal firearms, that are discovered to have warrants, that are, or that are discovered with other forms of contraband. And from a public safety perspective, that's just an indefensible position to my mind.
Well, and the piece of it too is that despite these studies that have come out, Roland Fryer at Harvard, the study that came out just a couple of months ago by researchers at Stetson University, that you just cannot find any systemic racial bias in policing in 2024 America, or Roland Fryer's data is a couple years old, but in the last 25 years, it just doesn't exist. Are there incidents of cops making bad judgment calls? Yes. Are there incidents of cops saying something or doing something that could be legitimately perceived as racist? Of course there are. But what they're saying is systemic. And so we need systemic policies in response to this systemic problem. And there's just no evidence of this systemic problem they assert exists. And that seems to color so much of the debate in these big cities, and frankly, what these politicians, both prosecutors and mayors, are able to get away with playing the race card.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two potential ways to interpret, the kind of arguments that people like Kim Foxx make, when they see these disparities. It's either a function of statistical ignorance or illiteracy, or, it's just they understand, the nuances of the argument, but they also understand that they can be effective rhetorically if they just focus in on the top line disparities. The problem with focusing on top line disparities in the way that Kim Foxx and company do is that they're ignoring the race neutral factors that would explain a lot of the disparities that they point to as evidence of systemic racism, right? I mean, so you can look at differences in the likelihood of being pulled over and searched, but here's the thing. I mean, the question is do you want police to be responsive to the most serious kinds of problems with respect to public safety? I think the answer that everyone would have to that question is yes. Right. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, although I'm a fairly young guy, when one of the sort of most potent critiques of American policing was that it wasn't responsive enough to Black crime. Right. The idea was that, police are racist. They don't care. They take so long to answer 911 calls. Right. I mean, you have the rap group Public Enemy. One of their most famous songs is 911 is a joke.
Yeah. Right.
Right. So that was the predominant idea. Well, guess what? Now we live at a time in which policing is very responsive to the most serious kinds of crimes that are disproportionately plaguing Black and brown communities throughout this country, right? I mean, in my book that you mentioned, I did an analysis of the 10 most dangerous neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, which in 2019 had a collective homicide rate of 61 per 100,000. Well, together they were 95+% Black or Latino, right? So that's where the serious victimization is happening. If you want police to be responsive to that and you want them to reduce those incidents of victimization, well, then they're going to have to put resources in the communities where that victimization is occurring. And if they do that, then they're going to have disproportionately more opportunities to interact with the people who fit the demographic profiles of those who are represented in those communities, right? So if you have neighborhoods like West Garfield Park and Humboldt Park and Austin and Inglewood, where the homicide rates are absolutely through the roof, and you have Black and Latino residents being, constituting 95, 96, 98% of the residents in those neighborhoods, well, you're going to get disparities when you send police to those neighborhoods in disproportionate numbers. Now, you can turn around and say, well, we want police resources to be distributed evenly throughout the city, irrespective of what the underlying crime problems are. And then eventually they'll make the argument that too is racist, because what you're doing is you're denying Black and brown communities the resources that they need because they have more serious problems that need more attention. Now, I'm actually more sympathetic to that second argument, right? I mean, to the extent that these disparities are a function of disparities in the deployment of limited police resources, I actually think that is evidence of anti-racism, right? Because again, what is the goal of policing in urban America? It is to reduce and control crime, particularly serious violent crime. Well, we know that in cities throughout this country, the vast majority of the serious violence, particularly gun violence, is experienced by Black and Latino residents. So the question becomes, it's like, why would a systemically racist institution seek to lower crime when we know that the lowering of those crime categories is going to disproportionately benefit the very groups that we're told those institutions are racist against, right? I mean, I pointed to this in my book, but in my chapter on race, I pointed to this analysis that was done by a very left of center criminologist, someone who certainly I think falls into the sort of depolicing, decarceration camp. His name is Patrick Sharkey. He did an analysis of the homicide decline between 1990 and 2014 and its effect on life expectancy by group for race. And what he found was that over that period, for Black males, right, the homicide decline meant 1 more year of life expectancy added over that period. For white males, it was only 0.14 years of life expectancy added. I mean, that's a more than 8x difference, right? So we know what the effects look like in terms of the racial distribution of the benefits associated with crime control, particularly serious violent crime control, right? We know that because, and that's so obvious and clear because we know where the serious gun violence is happening and what the demographics are of those neighborhoods. So how is it even a coherent argument when you have this reality in place, right? I mean, the idea that the police are racist doesn't contend with the fact that what they are doing, which is producing crime declines, is disproportionately benefiting the very groups that we're told they're racist against. It makes no sense.
I want to get your perspective on how criminals react to announcements that are policy choices. We were just talking about traffic stops that are constitutional. That's a policy choice that Kim Foxx may make to not prosecute crimes associated with searches, to discourage searches. We've also had in Chicago and in other cities announcements by mayors and by mayors and police chiefs mainly that we're going to reform our chase policy. We're not going to do car chases. We're going to reform our foot chase policy. We're not going to do foot chases. Those sorts of policy choices, what kind of impact do they have in terms of what people who are habitual offenders do?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that criminals are just, completely unintelligent and just not paying attention, I think is a silly one, right? It's very, very clear that the criminal offending population does keep an ear to the ground with respect to these things, and that their behavior is going to reflect, the incentive structures that are changing before them. They're aware of the bail reforms. They are aware of the chase policies. When a police department announces that, we're almost never going to chase except in these very, very limited circumstances, what does that do? It incentivizes individuals to run whenever they can. And I suspect that if someone were to do the analysis, what you would see is that in the wake of Chicago's announcements with their chase and car chase and foot chase policies, that you would see an increase in the rate at which people are running from car stops and running from police interactions. Again, it's just what bothers me, because specifically with the foot chase stuff, I mean, you've had a couple of Chicago police officers lose their life in foot chases with armed suspects. And what people don't understand is that when a police officer gets out of his or her car and gives chase of someone they suspect to be or know to be armed, what they are doing is they are subordinating their own safety. They are putting their life on the line for what? For the safety of the community that they're serving in that moment. That is incredibly noble, right? That is heroic in every sense of that word. And what I would like is for people like Kim Foxx to acknowledge that and to tell us how that comports with her argument that the broader institution is racist. Because if I were a real racist, right, if I were a racist police officer, the last thing that I would do is risk not coming home to my family in order to take a shooter off the street in a neighborhood that I don't live in or care about.
What about judges? We had just recently an individual in this country illegally who was charged in the killing, because he was driving under the influence, of a state trooper in Washington State. He had his bond lowered by a judge from $1 million to $100,000. And it's just a conversation about judges, too. We see this in big cities all the time. The headlines are daily. Somebody who has been arrested or convicted, or both, dozens and dozens of times, but yet gets a couple of years when the sentence could be much more prohibitive, much more impactful in terms of keeping that person off the street for a longer period of time. We don't know the judges as well as we do the prosecutors and the mayors. They don't have the same notoriety, even the ones that stand for election, because there's so many of them. traffic, these criminal courts not something that the public gets access to. Judges aren't having press conferences the way that politicians like prosecutors and mayors are. What to do about the same problem from the bench that we have from mayors' offices and prosecutors' offices?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real political problem, right? I mean, voters have limited bandwidth. And ultimately, the reason that these judges are able to get away with their misbehavior on the bench, and, when you're talking about these just ridiculously inappropriate rulings, I mean, it really is misbehavior. They're able to get away with that because the public just, either doesn't know or isn't informed. I mean, just think about your local election cycle. I mean, how many of the names on the ballot do you really recognize? And, what are we thinking that, the sort of median urban American resident actually knows about the judicial candidates in his or her jurisdiction? Most people, if they're Democrats, they just vote D down the line. If they're Republicans, they just vote R down the line. There's very little research that's being done, I suspect, and again, I think that's rational, right? I mean, we all have very busy lives, we all have things to do, and so it's a real political problem, right? I mean, the question becomes, how do we raise awareness to get people to pay more attention, particularly in the jurisdictions where that's an issue and where serious crime is an issue. And that's where I think there's a role for sort of right of center activism to document these issues and start putting out reports and grading judges and highlighting these news stories that everyone finds appalling and starting to include the judges' names in those things, and to say, well, this is the individual that decided that this person should have been released pre-trial, or this is the individual who decided that that 10 years was an appropriate sentence for a 20-year-old murderer. We did see some pushback with the parole board in Illinois, which was a good sign. But that's the kind of stuff that needs to happen more. These names need to get publicized, and I do think there's a role for an entity to start systematically tracking these rulings and grading judges in a way that's digestible for the voting population, and then getting that information out there in advance of these elections so that people can understand what they are voting for or against.
Yeah, we have this, again, in Chicago, just because it's such a good example of the bad example. We have a couple of things going on, too, that are sort of indicative of a culture. They're not the most central things when it comes to public safety, but they're indicative of a certain attitude toward public safety. One is, as you know, the decision by Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, to eliminate ShotSpotter in the city. And the other is this legislation that's making the rounds nationally now because it's so absurd, of redefining in statutory language criminals. You can't use the term
justice involved, right?
Not convict, not felon, but a justice involved individual. And again, the terminology used to refer to a criminal is not central, but when the General Assembly, when both chambers move this legislation to get it to the governor's desk in the closing days of session, it says something about a certain mentality, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It tells you where their head is at collectively. It tells you what their disposition is when it comes to the more serious issues. I mean, again, the question is there enough political will in the jurisdictions that are suffering the brunt of the consequences of these kinds of policies? Is it there? Is it strong enough to really offer a serious rebuke in the form of election losses? I mean, ultimately, that's what it comes down to. I do think politicians are rational actors like many other people. They will respond to incentives. And, right now, they have every reason to believe that they're going to be able to continue getting away with increasingly radical gestures and policy enactments. And, until, stories like, Chesa Boudin's recall or, Mike Schmidt's election loss become, not just outliers and exceptions to the rule, but the rule. I do think that we're going to continue to see them, push as far as they can actually push, because they know that, once these laws get on the books, the likelihood that they will be repealed in short order is pretty small. and they know that, and so they I think are willing to take those risks, politically, to push things that are radical in nature and that are misguided, because they have confidence that it's going to, at the very least, take a long time before a successful effort can be mounted to get those laws off the books. And I'm not sure they're wrong.
How much do you think the layering in of crimes being committed by people in this country illegally, who are largely centered in sanctuary cities, which are largely big urban centers, the same communities we're talking about, the same politicians we're talking about, how much does that impact sort of public attitude about public safety? In other words, could that be an accelerant for an attitude change that says, this is preventable crime, people who shouldn't be in this country, even if, again, it's a small percentage, but a small percentage of a big number can be a big problem, just like the indigenous population. So we have these sort of parallel problems that start from the same source, as unseriousness about the rule of law. So let's get serious about the rule of law with respect to people in this country illegally, and let's get serious about the rule of law with respect to the indigenous population. It almost sort of puts an exclamation point on the issue, and maybe that penetrates consciousness.
Yeah, maybe. But I think ultimately what that kind of rhetoric is going to be met with, predictably, is going to be accusations of racism, right? This is jingoism, this is nationalism, this is racism. You're just xenophobic. You don't want these people here because they have brown skin. I mean, that's exactly how that's going to be responded to, and we know that there's an audience for that kind of critique. And so, I'm not sure it's going to be particularly politically powerful. To my mind, the thing to keep really hammering home are these examples of individuals who continuously come into contact with the criminal justice system, including Border Patrol, right? I mean, some of these stories you see of illegal, immigrants who've committed these heinous offenses, who have been deported 6 or 7 times before. I mean, what people need to understand is that the mere existence of the rule is not enough on its own to produce the desired outcome. You need dedicated enforcement. You need commitment to the ideal that the rule is meant to represent, and that's where I think we've kind of fallen off. You see this kind of in the gun control debate too. I mean, there's this ongoing argument about, do we need additional restrictions? And you have one side saying, well, no, we have enough gun laws as it is. If we just enforce them, we would actually, that would do significantly more good than passing more laws that aren't going to get enforced. And I think that resonates with a lot of people because they're able to sort of understand the logic of it. And I think here too. So it's just a matter of continuing to highlight these stories, and then from a sort of more database perspective, just to hammer home the share of crimes that this stuff accounts for. It's not.
Remind me.
The benefits are big.
Remind us again. You've got this great data that we've talked about before. The number of times I think it's the number of times the average person who's accused of murder has been arrested.
So yeah, in the city of Chicago, the typical homicide or shooting suspect has been arrested 12 prior times. Almost 1 in 5, I think it's like 18% of them, have been arrested more than 20 times. And that's just in the city of Chicago. I mean, and you see that pattern throughout the criminal justice system, right? In the state prison population, the average prisoner in a state prison has between 10 and 12 prior arrests and between 5 and 6 prior convictions. In the city of Washington, D.C., the typical homicide suspect has 11 prior arrests. In Baltimore, it's between 9 and 10 prior arrests, right? So this is a pattern that we see play itself out over and over and over again. And, the more that kind of data gets highlighted for people, I think, the rational among us will see that and say, well, my goodness, this shouldn't be. I think everyone is on board with this idea that we should give people second chances, right? We have Second Chance Month in the United States that just passed. And I'm for second chances, right? But what people don't understand is the degree to which the people who are driving our crime problem, the people who are populating our jails and prisons, have had and blown second, third, fourth, fifth, and 10th chances. And the more that information gets out there, the more sane policy I think we'll start to see, as time moves on. And hopefully, some of the things that you pointed out at the outset of our conversation are signs of what's to come.
Rafael Mangual, he's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor to City Journal, his book, Criminal Injustice. Rafael, thanks for joining us on Counterculture. Really appreciate your time and insights, as always. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Always great to talk to you.
Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.